my canonical or standard format order. And I could map order 2 on the left to the same order on the right. So the point is, it gives me the ability to aggregate from multiple data sources. Maybe you've got different regions and they each have their own instance of a database and you want to be able to bring those together. Well, this allows you to take multiple similar data sources and aggregate them together into one single event so that we can have aggregate metrics or total metrics across multiple sources. It also works such that everything we do from this point forward, which will be creating metrics, creating dashboards, is actually built off of this archetype event, not off of the real event. And the benefit of that is that while today we started out with the database and from that we built the real event. From the real event, we built an archetype event. I actually don't need to do it that way. I could have created the archetype event manually, specifying an event name and field names, and then built the metrics and built the dashboards off of that. So what this means is that if you have certain domain expertise as to what are the events you're looking for and what are the calculations you want to do with those, I can define those events and fields and metrics and dashboards before I have access to the actual data. And then when the data becomes available, I simply drop this archetype in place, point it back to the event from the data that's then become available, and all the other pieces are already built and ready to go. So you can have a very quick deliverable if you build your domain expertise into these archetypes before you have access to the data. So those are some of the reasons for this event mapping step. So what's next? We've done step 3, so now we go to step 4, where we actually define the metrics, the KPIs we want. I mentioned one we'd work with is revenue. So we'll start with revenue. Now, revenue is going to be based on looking at the set of not forecast events, but revenue comes from my orders. The actual tool for defining revenue is right here, and this is another instance where most approaches would have you drop down to some level of syntax or scripting to write the formulas. In my case, if I want to aggregate the total revenue across my orders, I say I want to do a form of aggregation. Well, I might want to look at the number of orders, say number of orders per city or country or whatever. I might want to look at average order size, but in this case I want to sum up something across each of my orders. What do I want to sum up across my orders? Well, I go down to the next level of detail, and here I can put in a mathematical statement where maybe it's complex and I put in a conditional logic or create a reusable formula or call an external DLL to reuse logic that's already on my system. But in this case I'll do a simple math expression where I'll say that the actual value of the order is the unit price times the quantity. So now I've defined what the meaning of revenue is, and also take note that the traditional way of doing this, where you're using an ETL tool, well, the actual calculation would most likely be embedded in the SQL, in the ETL process, so not only would it slow down your back, if someone was asked to sign off on revenue numbers and what revenue meant, well, they'd have to take someone's word for it as to what was happening within the SQL. In this case, it's a graphical representation of what revenue is that's accessible even to someone who's not a programmer to understand what we're actually doing here. So now that we've specified what we're doing for revenue or what it means and how we're calculating revenue, we can also specify how we want to use this. And what I mean by that is that here we see the order event from which we're generating our revenue, and I can specify which of these fields in the event do I want to be available as dimensions. By checking off city, country, and employee, that means that when we calculate the metrics, we're going to calculate it pre-broken down or dimensioned by each of these values, meaning that when we want to display revenue, it'll be quick and easy for us to say, well, I want to look at it by employee, or maybe I want to look at it by city, or maybe I want to look at it by city and then employee within a city. Any of these in any combination will be easily accessible to us, and I'll show you that in just a few moments. In addition to saying what we want as the dimensions, we also put in a calculation interval. So for instance, the default would be 1 day, meaning we're going to store the revenue values in daily increments. Now, if someone on the dashboard wants to look at the revenue per week or per month, that's not a problem because we can efficiently roll up the daily values into a larger value. But if someone wanted to look at revenue per hour, well, you couldn't do that if you're storing it per day. So that's the reason for the calculation interval. You would choose whatever the smallest value that you want someone to be able to examine. Maybe you want to store the revenue per minute. If you have real-time data coming in, then we certainly support that. In this case, I'm going to choose per month. So now I've built one metric called revenue. Let's build another one for the forecast, this time based on my forecast event. And this one is going to be very similar to the previous one. I'm simply going to aggregate. I'm going to sum up something across each of my forecasts, and across each forecast, I simply want to be summing up the sales targets for that time period. And this one I didn't give any extra dimension values, but I will say that I also want this one to be done on a monthly basis. Now I did both of those because I wanted to illustrate that once I've got revenue and I've got forecast, what I really want to do is I want to relate those two. I want to see how I'm doing against my forecast. And the revenue might be coming from Oracle and SQL Server and the forecast from Excel, but it doesn't matter. Once I've got these metrics, I can always say I want to create a new metric such as percent of forecast. And this new metric is going to be based on other KPIs I've already built. And in this case, I'm going to say that I want to take the revenue divided by the forecast, and because it's a percent, I'll say times 100. So now I've defined what I might call a composite KPI based on other KPIs. Now one more thing I have to do here. If I have a metric such as revenue, and I've got revenue for January and February and March, and I want to look at the quarterly revenue, well, I'd simply add those up. I'd sum them up. But if I've got the percent of forecast in January and the same for February and March, you don't add the percent of forecast. You would want to average them. And typically, mathematically, you would do it by the denominator, which would in this case be the forecast. So this is simply showing the roll-up type. It allows you to specify how you're going to combine the metrics across multiple time periods. So at this point, I go back to my guide, and I've completed step 4 in defining the key performance indicators I care about. So I go down to step 5, which is to set up access rights. Now, we deal with access rights by user and or role, and users and roles can also have properties. Now, in this case, because I reset my system, I only have one default user showing here, the administrative user. But it is worth note that virtually all of our larger customers don't define the users and roles within our system. We also provide the ability to map this back to an Active Directory or single sign-on or LDAP environment. So we would typically get the users, groups, and properties from within the existing security infrastructure. Once we have that, for each user or role, you can specify within this Studio tool we're currently looking at which features can they see the data for and which ones are they allowed to modify. So it's based on this that I was able to say that only certain users might be able to change the database connection, where maybe other users have the rights to modify the formulas that I'm using to monitor the business. Now this tab was showing me things that this user can do within Studio, but if I go to the Web Dashboard tab, I can also specify for each user or role, are they allowed to log into a dashboard? Are they allowed to customize or modify or create new dashboards? Are they allowed to use our various integration services, which includes web services if you want to deliver this data via a web service? And also at another level of granularity, you can determine for each user or role which of the metrics are they allowed to see. And you even have the ability, when you tie into something like an LDAP system that has users and properties, you can use the properties to further scope the data. So for instance, I might say that you're allowed to see the revenue, but only the revenue for the city that is your city. So in other words, I can have one dashboard, and I can have different people log into it and see different numbers. I see the numbers for my city. You log into the same dashboard. You see the numbers for your city. Our manager logs in, and with different permissions, might see the results across the entire organization. So there's fine-grained access control at all levels here. So that was step 5, determining access rights. Step 6 is actually deploying the system. You can have any number of deployments, a test deployment, a production deployment, and at minimum, for a deployment, all you need to do is specify what database am I going to deploy this to. Well, that's why I created this deploy connection early in the process here. Once I've done that, I've specified I'm pushing it out to this database here. I now simply click on the deploy button, and this is going to take all of the definitions that I've built into Studio, and it's going to push those out into that deploy database that I've pointed to. It's also going to create the table for my metrics mart inside this deploy database, so that there'll be tables to store the fully dimensioned, fully broken down revenue values, as well as any other metrics that we've chosen will be stored in this deploy database.